The future of this world is African. Allow me to say this once again a little louder for those of you in the back. The future is African. The tables are turning, and Africa's role in the authorship of whatever is yet to come for this world is going to be huge, and it will be consequential. By the year 2050, more than...
China says it will provide zero-tariff treatment for 6 least developed countries in Africa. Starting from Monday, 98% of taxable products from Angola, the Gambia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Madagascar, Mali and Mauritania will be exempt from tariffs when entering China. This will increase the number of African countries receiving such treatment to 27 by the end of this year. China also plans to expand its zero...
They had the nerve, the audacity to let black folks suffer for 460 years. And at the end of the civil rights movement, rather than going back and saying, let's find out what has happened to black folk for 460 years, have they been psychologically, emotionally, politically, educationally damaged? Nobody spent 1 minute of time trying to figure out what had happened to black folk over all that period of time. So in the course of the civil rights movement, at the end of it, they say, well, let's pretend that nothing has happened to them, that they were not injured, they were not hurt. And now let's go seek integration and pretend that we're all equal. Now that was grossly unfair, because by that point in time, and by the 1966 period, whites had become economic giants in America. They owned and controlled everything at that point in time. Black folk didn't own anything. Whites controlled almost 100% of all the wealth, the income, the privileges, the businesses, the resources, and all levels of government. Blacks had nothing. Blacks were 1-foot midgets. And they allowed us then to use integration to walk from our communities, from our ghettos over in their communities, totally disarmed, not understanding anything, blind, naked, and then saying that you can go and compete. Compete with what?
The future of this world is African. Allow me to say this once again a little louder for those of you in the back. The future is African. The tables are turning, and Africa's role in the authorship of whatever is yet to come for this world is going to be huge, and it will be consequential. By the year 2050, more than 25% of the world's population is expected to come from the African continent. Africa is a catalyst for systemic change. If this reality, which is fact-based and straightforward, seems provocative or unsettling, perhaps it's because you are viewing it through the lens of centuries of filters, colonialism and imperialism. In this era of global uncertainty, Africa must exercise sovereignty over its natural resources to raise the necessary funds to ensure the well-being of its citizens. We're tired of the continued image of poverty-stricken, disease-ridden rural communities living at the periphery of huge foreign-controlled natural resource concession areas. We're tired of having people extract the most they can from us and in return offer us the very least by way of respect, consideration, and dignity. We're tired of not being represented in ways that reveal the richness and complexity of our history or acknowledge all that we have overcome to arrive here. In 1945, the sun had not yet set on the largest empire in history. The most common mode of international travel was by sea. The personal computer had not been invented, let alone made portable. And television, a new convenience, was still in its infancy, albeit in black and white color. Fast track 80 years on. In today's world, hundreds of thousands of commercial flights take off and land every day.
The quiet hum of diplomatic offices across Europe carried an unusual tension, a restlessness that had been building for months. Reports from financial institutions, trade bodies, intelligence agencies, and energy watchdogs told the same unsettling story. Africa's economic rise was no longer a distant forecast. It was here present, powerful and accelerating faster than anyone in Europe had predicted. What began as subtle shifts in trade patterns had become a political storm, one shaking the foundations of Europe's long-established influence. In the beginning, Europe's concerns were whispered, wrapped in polite diplomatic language about changing dynamics and emerging opportunities. But beneath the pleasantries lay a profound worry. The continent that many European governments once saw as dependent was rewriting the rules of global power. Africa was no longer simply a supplier of commodities or a destination for basic exports. It had become a gravitational force pulling global investment, strategic partnerships, and technological innovation toward itself. The world was moving, and Europe felt the ground shifting under its feet. The first shock came from the energy sector. Africa's new green corridors, hydrogen hubs, solar megaplants, geothermal grids, and wind power basins had drawn billions from Asia and the Middle East. European investors, once confident in their dominant position, watched as Africa forged partnerships that excluded them completely. Conferences that Europeans once led were now being held without them. Invitations went to South American, Middle Eastern, and Asian delegations instead. Within Europe's ministries, analysts traced the shift back to Africa's decision to reclaim control over its natural resources. A series of new economic rules required foreign firms to process minerals within African borders, forcing industries to build factories, create jobs, and transfer technology. For decades, Europe had benefited from Africa exporting raw materials cheaply while buying back expensive finished goods. The new model disrupted everything. European industries that relied on inexpensive African inputs suddenly faced rising costs, delayed shipments, and restricted supply. The second shock erupted in agriculture. Africa's investment in modern farming, boosted by tech-driven irrigation, drone-managed plantations, and robotic harvesting, had transformed its food sector. Well-funded African agricultural blocs began exporting high-demand crops to the Middle East and Asia, bypassing traditional European markets. At the same time, Africa restricted low-quality food imports that once flowed freely from Europe. The symbolic but devastating message was clear: Africa had outgrown dependency. European farmers' unions reacted with alarm. They organized protests outside parliamentary buildings, waving placards about unfair competition and the slow death of their traditional markets. Leaders knew the real issue was deeper. Europe had underestimated Africa's determination to become self-sufficient as agriculture shifted. So, did finance? African stock exchanges began merging into a continental digital trading network. Tech-enabled financial hubs rose from Nairobi to Kigali to Accra, drawing global fintech giants hungry for access to Africa's young, dynamic population. Europe's aging demographic stood in sharp contrast. African markets offered growth, innovation, and energy, three things Europe increasingly struggled to generate on its own. Investors redirected billions toward African startups and infrastructure projects. As the money flowed south, Europe felt a sudden financial drought. The third shock came in the form of global manufacturing. Africa's industrial zones, powered by renewable energy and backed by strong investment partnerships, became attractive alternatives to Asia. Factories once built in Eastern Europe began relocating to African coastal corridors where labor was competitive, energy was cheaper, and transportation was being transformed by new ports, railways, and highways. European leaders expected Africa to grow, but not like this, not rapidly, not competitively, and certainly not at Europe's expense. Behind closed doors, some European officials tried to downplay the shift as temporary, but the data told another story. Africa had tapped into something Europe no longer possessed: the momentum of a rising continent with vast resources, a young workforce, and a willingness to embrace technological disruption. Diplomatic relations became tense. European states pushed for new trade agreements they hoped would preserve some influence. African leaders refused. The old terms, they demanded fairness, partnership, and shared interests, not the paternalism of decades past. Europe was forced to abandon the subtle arrogance that had shaped its foreign policy for generations. The new African negotiating teams were educated, strategic, and unapologetically ambitious. They spoke confidently about national interests, industrial sovereignty, and global positioning. The tone was different, now self-assured and unshakable. The fourth shock came from the security sector. Africa's new anti-piracy coalitions, regional defense treaties, and technology-driven border systems drastically reduced reliance on European military assistance. Intelligence-sharing networks expanded between African nations and Asian partners, bypassing Europe entirely. For many European policymakers, this was perhaps the most unsettling shift of all. Africa was rewriting the global balance of security partnerships. What truly rattled Europe, however, were the alliances forming across Africa's political landscape. Continental free trade policies had unified markets, cross-border infrastructure created. New power blocks, a unified satellite navigation system for Africa reduced dependency on external technology, and the ambitious digital ID system sweeping across the continent created a harmonized environment for trade, banking, and travel. European diplomats struggled to adjust. They were used to dealing with fragmented African states, each negotiating separately, but now they faced continental unity driven by shared economic goals. Europe was witnessing not just economic growth, but the rise of a geopolitical force capable of reshaping global structures. The fifth shock was cultural. African media, fashion, entertainment, literature, and film exploded onto global platforms. Streaming services signed multi-year partnerships with African studios. Worldwide audiences embraced African stories, music, and style. Europe, long accustomed to exporting culture, found itself increasingly influenced by African trends. The cultural power shift amplified everything else. A continent that shaped global culture could no longer be dismissed as a peripheral actor. Economic analysts in Europe began warning of a deeper crisis. Africa's rise meant Europe needed to rethink its identity, strategy, and future. The old models of engagement, extraction, control, and one-sided deals were no longer viable. Europe would have to compete, innovate, and collaborate on equal terms. But the continent had grown comfortable, complacent even, believing its influence would last forever. Meanwhile, Africa forged ahead. Infrastructure corridors linked landlocked economies to ports. A continent-wide digital payment system opened new markets. Tech universities partnered with global engineers to build AI labs, green energy. Innovation attracted international acclaim. Africa's high-speed rail projects and electric vehicle corridors gained admiration. The final shock came when Africa launched a unified investment authority that pooled funds from sovereign wealth entities and private investors across the continent. The goal was simple: finance African development with African resources. Europe, accustomed to stepping in as lender or advisor, found itself shut out of crucial decisions. African nations no longer needed to negotiate from a position of weakness. They had their own capital, their own agenda, and rising global partners eager to collaborate. What Europe had never anticipated was that Africa's rise would reveal its own vulnerabilities. Aging populations, slow economic growth, rising energy costs, and political uncertainty made Europe fragile. Africa, by contrast, had youth, ambition, natural resources, and technological hunger. It had room to grow and the determination to do so on its own terms. Caught off guard, European leaders convened emergency summits. They debated how to regain influence, but none of the old strategies worked anymore. The world was aligning around Africa not because Europe had failed, but because Africa had finally claimed its rightful place. It was a shift rooted in confidence, strategy, and unity. Europe understood something fundamental. Africa's rise was not a threat, but a transformation, yet it was shaking Europe precisely because Europe had built too much of its stability on assumptions about Africa as limitations. When those assumptions collapsed, so did the foundations beneath them. The new reality was undeniable. Africa had become the seat of global attention, a magnet for investment, innovation, and influence. The continent's rise was irreversible, and Europe could no longer stop the shift, only adapt to it. Across Europe's diplomatic halls, the realization echoed like a warning and a prophecy. The world had entered a new age, and Africa was no longer waiting for permission to lead it. Europe could feel the power shift in every negotiation, every market trend, and every declining line on its trade graphs. The continent that once shaped the world was now being reshaped by the world's fastest rising power. And in that rise lay the truth no one in Europe could escape. Africa's moment had arrived, and the world, especially Europe, would never be the same. The anxiety spreading across Europe was no longer confined to ministries and policy rooms. It seeped into stock markets, energy exchanges, manufacturing unions, and old diplomatic circles that had long assumed African states would always rely on European guidance. But now, Europe found itself studying Africa with a mixture of disbelief and urgency, trying to understand the forces behind the continent's sudden surge in global prominence. What Europeans failed to grasp was that Africa's rise had been decades in the making. Beneath the surface of political transitions and uneven development, a quiet revolution had been unfolding. Young innovators built startups in bustling tech hubs. Resource-rich nations forged strategic alliances to demand value addition on their own soil. Education reforms created a new class of engineers, economists, and scientists. And a shared determination rooted in history, resilience, and ambition wove together African nations that had once been divided. As the power shift accelerated, Europe struggled to propose a response. Economic advisors argued for aggressive reinvestment in Africa, urging leaders to accept the fact that the terms of engagement had changed forever. Others clung to outdated strategies, insisting Europe could still regain influence by leveraging old agreements. But those agreements were relics of a world that no longer existed. A wave of canceled contracts hit European corporations that had once dominated African infrastructure projects. Energy firms that relied on African oil, gas, and critical minerals found themselves squeezed out by new African policies that prioritized domestic industries and preferred partners from Asia and the Middle East. For the first time in decades, Europe felt the sting of competition in places it once viewed as guaranteed territory, African. Governments grew increasingly selective about whom they worked with and under what terms. New continental standards required transparency, technology transfer, environmental protections, and the hiring of local workers. These demands were non-negotiable. European companies accustomed to operating on their own terms struggled to adapt. Many pulled out of negotiations altogether, unwilling or unable to meet the new criteria. Meanwhile, Africa's emerging business class, confident, well-trained, and globally connected, stepped into the vacuum. They built their own enterprises, attracting partners from around the world, transforming cities into economic powerhouses, and proving that Africa's progress was not dependent on Europe's approval. Every success story amplified Africa's global reputation. Every new partnership signaled another step toward independence. And with each step, Europe felt its leverage slipping. The cultural transformation made the shift even more visible. African fashion took over runways in major European cities. Music festivals across Europe featured African artists as headliners. African films dominated international award circuits, celebrated for their depth, creativity, and unique voice. It was more than cultural influence, it was cultural leadership, and Europe, long seen as the center of global artistic expression, realized it was no longer the only storyteller the world admired. Energy dependence deepened. Europe's panic. Africa's decision to redirect portions of its gas, hydrogen, and critical mineral exports toward Asia and the Middle East sent shockwaves through European industries already grappling with rising costs. Green energy firms scrambled to find replacements for African cobalt, manganese, and rare earth minerals critical to Europe's sustainability ambitions. But Africa had made its priorities clear. Partners who invested in Africa's future would receive Africa's resources. Those who viewed the continent merely as an extraction zone would not. The shift was not born from hostility. It was rooted in self-respect and strategy. Africa had learned the cost of asymmetrical partnerships. Now it demanded cooperation, not dominance, and for the first time, the world listened. The conversations shifted from what can Europe offer Africa to what role will Africa allow Europe to play. It was a reversal Europe had never imagined. Diplomatic delegations traveled across African capitals, seeking new agreements, but they were met with firm terms. Fair trade, industrial collaboration, and precise timelines for commitments. Africa had clarity, Europe had urgency, and the contrast defined the new world order. In the final months of Europe's reckoning, a continental conference in Africa broadcast a statement that would echo across the globe. African leaders affirmed their shared goal, to become the world's largest integrated economic zone by leveraging resources, human capital, and new technologies. The message stunned European audiences. Africa was no longer responding to global trends, it was setting them. The symbolic impact was profound. For over a century, Europe had imagined itself the center around which global development revolved. But now it faced a future where Africa, with its massive population, rising economies, and unified strategy, was emerging as a global anchor. What frightened Europe most was not the loss of control, but the speed of the change. A shift they expected to unfold over generations had taken place within a decade. The old world was dissolving, a new one was rising, and Africa was at the heart of it. And despite Europe's panic, Africa's rise was not built on conquest, coercion, or rivalry. It was built on empowerment. Africa chose investment over debt traps, innovation over imitation, unity over fragmentation, self-determination over dependency. In the calm after Europe's initial shock, many began to understand the truth. Africa's rise was not a threat to global stability, it was a rebalancing long overdue. A world that depended on fairness, diversity, and shared growth could not thrive with one continent perpetually suppressed. Africa's rise did not diminish Europe. It challenged Europe to evolve. The conclusion was inescapable. The power shift was not an accident, nor a temporary spike. It was the result of millions of Africans shaping a new future, one decision, one partnership, one innovation at a time. Europe, once confident in its unshakable influence, now faced the undeniable reality that global power had become multipolar. And in this new world, Africa was no longer on the sidelines. It was a central force, a continental voice, a global architect. The rise of Africa had shaken Europe not because Europe was weak, but because Africa had finally embraced its strength. The world was turning, and Africa was leading the turn.